Thank you for coming. This is my first in-person field day here at the Range Cattle Center. I was part of the virtual one where I talked a little bit about some of my coyote work in previous positions. But since a lot of you don't know me, I figured I'd take a few minutes, introduce myself, and then talk about what we do in my lab, and then we'll get into invasive species. And so, I grew up in London, Kentucky, a small town in southeastern Kentucky in the foothills of the Appalachians. My dad's family was tobacco farmers. My mom's family was coal miners. But I grew up living sort of an idyllic life in the 80s and 90s, playing in the creek, catching crawdads and leeches, and terrifying my mom with the things I'd bring back. And that sort of love of nature really built throughout my childhood. And so I went to Ohio State in Columbus, got a master's or a bachelor's in wildlife management, and then went on to the Indiana University of Pennsylvania, which is in Pennsylvania, in the town of Indiana, about an hour and a half outside of Pittsburgh. And there I got my master's in biology studying fishers, which are a large weasel-like carnivore that live in the forest in that part of the country. After getting my master's, I moved up to Trent University in Ontario, Canada, where I got my PhD studying coyotes and caribou and their interactions in the island of Newfoundland, which is off the Canadian coast. Pretty cold island. I think the max temperature there is in the 70s, and there's feet of snow on the ground from October to May. So it's an interesting environment for coyotes to persist in and have an impact on caribou. And after I finished up my PhD, I went on and postdoced at Ohio State University. Returning to my original bachelor's alma mater was an interesting experience, and there I studied river otter populations in Ohio and the impact of the reestablishment of river otters and ongoing trapping efforts for the fur industry there. And I also studied urban coyotes in downtown Chicago, and coyotes that lived in more rural areas like Cape Breton, Canada. Now, after finishing up that postdoc, I came down here to the University of Florida Range Cattle Center. That was in the midst of COVID. I started in July 2020, and international moves with families is pretty complicated, so I didn't arrive here in Florida till January 21. Now, I'll give you a little background on my family, just very briefly. My wife's also an ecologist, Erin Cohen, and she does ecology at really big spatial scales. So she's looking at as a contract researcher with USGS, she's looking at how sea level rise in Florida is impacting a lot of the amphibians along the coastline. We got 2 boys, 5 and 7 years old, and we live just next door in Manatee County. So when I established the Rangeland Wildlife Ecology Lab here at the center, one of the main goals of our lab is to conserve and contribute to the conservation and management of rangeland wildlife species. And I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here when I say that working rangelands, like our pastures around here, can sustain a lot of wildlife diversity. And you might have seen some of the diversity that we're capturing here at the center with our camera networks and our acoustic data. So if you're on the Range Cattle Center's social media or you get some of the newsletters, you might have seen our Caught on Camera newsletters. Those are sort of our highlights, monthly highlights of the animals that we see right here at the center. So we've seen well over 20 mammal species, almost 100 different bird species seen and heard right here at the center, and lots of reptiles and amphibians as well. And really, I liked Dr. Engel's introduction and how our mission, I think here at the center especially, is to help to maintain the viability of these working rangelands, because the alternative to these working rangelands development, like what we're seeing on the coast, is a lot less sustainable for wildlife and for a lot of the other ecosystem values that rangelands provide. So as part of the overarching, I think, mission of the center, which is maintaining the viability of working rangelands, I would add, enhance the ecosystem values that our rangelands provide and quantify it. I think the pathway to quantifying those benefits is what can lead us to eventual payment for ecosystem services in water and soil and in wildlife as well. So I'll plug one of my grad students real quick. Zach Holmes is a master's student in my lab. He's looking at the avian diversity that is occurring on working rangelands at DeLuca Preserve in Osceola County and here at the center. And the data that he's collecting with acoustic recording units, so with the assistance of AI, to identify all those bird calls from those data, is contributing to the knowledge that we have about the bird communities that can persist on working rangelands, and the way that rangelands are managed in terms of stocking rate and rotation schedules and how those impact the bird communities. But the bulk of what I want to talk about today is invasive species, and I'm going to talk about two invasive species, one that I'm pretty sure you all have experience with and know about, and one that you might not know too much about. But first, I think we should define what an invasive species is. So invasive species is a non-native animal. So non-native means it didn't evolve or didn't originate in this geographic area. So a tiger is non-native to Florida. Tiger is not an invasive species in Florida. It doesn't occur in Florida outside of zoos, but it is non-native. Now the next key point for an invasive species is that it has been introduced to an area. So it wasn't in an area before, it now is. Those introductions can be intentional or unintentional. Now, there's an example I can think of a non-native species that has been introduced but is not invasive, is the crepe myrtle. Like it's a landscape tree that's common in Florida. That tree doesn't really escape our landscaping. It isn't an invasive species because the final key point for an invasive species is that it causes harm. And that's really the kicker. You can have species that aren't native. You can have species that are established, meaning self-replicating in the wild. But as long as they don't cause harm, they're not invasive. And by harm, we mean economic harm, harm to our industries, harm to agriculture, to livestock production, or environmental harm, harm to our ecosystems, harm to our species, to our water, to our soil, or even human harm. And there's many invasive species in Florida. We're one of the hot spots for invasive species in the U.S. There's things like lionfish in our coastal waters. There's Brazilian pepper tree on our land. And IFAS recognizes that we're an invasive species hotspot. We've got many faculty and staff at the university dedicated to working with invasive species. And I'm part of some of the groups that do that, the Invasive Species Council, for example. But today, like I said, I want to talk about two invasive species. The first one I'm going to talk about is wild pigs. So why are wild pigs an invasive species? Well, they're non-native, right? Wild pigs are, and I'll back up a second, just in case you aren't familiar with the wild pig term. So wild pigs is the term that we use for any pig that occurs outside of a fence here in North America. So that is synonyms with feral swine, wild boar, feral hog, piney woods rooter. All of those terms are wild pigs. Any pig that's outside of a fence here in Florida is a wild pig. Now, wild pigs are the feral descendants of our domestic stock of pigs. And pigs as a domestic animal are really important for industry here in North America, for industry globally. But pigs themselves, I'm talking the domestic pigs, are the descendants of a wild boar ancestor. And the wild boars still exist on the landscape in Europe, Asia, and North Africa. So that's where wild pigs or wild boar are native to. But everywhere outside of Europe, Asia, and North Africa is non-native areas for wild pigs. So North America, South America, Sub-Saharan Africa, Australia, and many parts of Oceania, like Hawaii and Guam, have wild pig populations, and they're non-native there. And they have been introduced there, right? So they were introduced mostly intentionally here in North America. The first introduction actually occurred here in Florida by Spanish explorers and colonizers nearly 500 years ago. Spanish arrived on the Gulf Coast, not too far from here, and they had pigs on their ships, and they said, well, wouldn't it be a good idea when we return in 1 to 2 years to have these pigs easily caught and we got this nice food source? So they let some of their pigs loose on the landscape, and that was the first introduction of wild pigs to North America. Now, since then, since the 1500s, there's been many introductions, intentional and unintentional, across North America that have really allowed wild pigs to spread everywhere. And now they occur in 39 of our 50 states. USDA estimates there's over 5 million wild pigs, so that's pigs that are living outside of a fence in the United States. And Florida has one of the largest populations statewide. It's behind only California and Texas, and the reason it's behind those states is because those states are much bigger than ours. So Florida has over 500,000 wild pigs on its landscape. And wild pigs cause harm, and we'll talk about some of those harms here in a minute. So, but first, I just want to introduce some biological facts that are important for us to know and understand about wild pigs, because they impact what sort of damage we receive on the landscape due to pigs, and they impact how we end up managing those pigs. So wild pigs are highly reproductive. A female pig will become reproductively active at about 7 months of age. Now here in Florida, they can produce an average of 1.5 litters of pigs per year. So that means 2 litters every 3 years. So high reproductive capability. Each of those litters averages 4 to 6 piglets. So with those sort of numbers, what we can see is that one pregnant sow, one pregnant adult female, in 2 years can lead to over 100 new pigs on the landscape, including her direct offspring and her descendants of her first generation offspring. So that's a substantial reproductive capability on the landscape. Now the other reason, another reason why pigs are really successful invasive species is because they're what we call diet and habitat generalists. That means that they can eat about anything and live about anywhere. This is a key trait for a lot of invasive animals, in fact. So what we mean by that is that they literally can live anywhere. So they live here, and they live on the edge of suburbia over in Manatee County. They live down in the Everglades. They can persist in a variety of landscapes. But there is one limitation that wild pigs have here in Florida, and that's heat, right? They're not very good at thermoregulation. That's because they're not very good sweaters. So when it gets hot, they can't release that heat from their body starts overheating, and they can enter heat stress. So pigs' adaptation to this problem is to always live near some body of water. So they'll actually get into bodies of water to cool their bodies down. Or they'll find depressions in the landscape and roll in mud and cool their bodies by coating their bodies in mud. And that's one of those key sort of habitat damaging, environmental damaging behaviors, which is called a wallow. And we'll return to that in a minute. Now, pigs socially exist in a couple different structures on the landscape. The female adult pigs will group together with other related female pigs, so like sisters and aunts. They group together and raise their piglets all together in a group. It's called a sounder. Now, once the male piglets reach reproductive maturity, they get kicked out of that group. But the female piglets often stay in that group throughout their life. Now, the males, when they're kicked out, will exist in one of two structures on the landscape. You'll have your alpha male, and it's going to be solitary. That's going to be the male on your landscape that's doing most of the breeding. And then you'll have bachelor groups of inferior males, at least inferior relative to that alpha male, and they'll exist in small bachelor groups of 3 to 5 individuals. The sounders, however, do exist in large groups, potentially up to 20 pigs at any given time in those groups. Now, several studies have been conducted on wild pigs in Florida, and from that we've learned that a sounder, that group of female pigs and his piglets, needs on average about 375 acres of land in the rangelands here in central Florida. But that number is going to vary from place to place, and that's because the home range size, or the territory that these animals use, that's the space that they need to meet their energetic needs and to find water, varies depending on the underlying landscape. So in landscapes that have a lot of food for wild pigs, they can have smaller territories. than 375 acres. Conversely, areas that are a bit more difficult for pigs to navigate, perhaps at the periphery of suburbanized and urban areas, those lands might not have as many natural food sources for pigs, and so their territories might need to be a bit larger. But one key fact that this study found was that those solitary males use about double the amount of space as the sounders, the group of females. And they do that because that's a way that they can overlap with multiple sounder groups and maximize their reproduction. So if a sounder needs about 375 acres, then an alpha male is going to use about 750 acres on the land. Now let's talk food for a little bit. Pigs are omnivores. That means that they can eat plant material and they also consume animal protein as well. I'd say on the spectrum, they're more on the plant side, but they will definitely opportunistically consume animal protein in the form of invertebrates when they're foraging on the landscape, salamanders that occur in some of the sensitive habitats that wild pigs use, and they'll even go after nests of ground nesting animals like turkey and even sea turtle we've seen. And the reason they do that is because eggs have a really high energy inside them. They have a lot of fat and protein that is attractive to pigs and to the other invasive animal we'll talk about in a minute. So pigs do have some types of foods they like more than others. They really like acorns in the fall, and they really like roots and tubers in the spring. Especially. They'll eat roots and tubers year-round, but in the spring is when those are the finest delicacy for pigs. And the way that they go after these roots and tubers is they'll use their snout to push under the dirt and upturn the dirt, and that's called rooting. And that sort of rooting behavior leads to the major source of damage that we see from wild pigs on the landscape. So you get a sounder of pigs, 20-something pigs, they're all rooting the landscape, turning up the soil, looking for roots and tubers, and they come back to that site multiple nights in a row because perhaps it's a particularly good site with lots of nice roots and tubers, and you can all of a sudden have a substantial amount of your property rooted up. And so research done over in Buck Island actually found that when they looked at pastures that had pigs present versus pastures that didn't, those pastures where pigs were present were experiencing rooting damage that was somewhere between 40 and 60% of the forage grass cover. And that level of loss of forage grass cover, that translates directly into calf production values per acre. And so that is having an economic impact. So you take the economic impact of pigs in Florida on our livestock production, and you add that to the economic impact of pigs in terms of crop damage, agriculture crop damage, and direct consumption, and the USDA estimates that in the United States, there's over $1.5 billion in agriculture damages and control efforts for wild pigs here in the country. That's a lot of money, that's a lot of loss. And so there's our economic harm. Now, our environmental harm takes a variety of conditions or states on the landscape. So when pigs wallow, right, they're often wallowing in depressed areas. So those are some of our really sensitive ecosystems, our temporary wetlands, where a lot of our salamanders and our frogs and toads are having a crucial life stage where they're laying eggs and having that tadpole phase. And so when pigs come in and wallow that landscape, they create a big mud pile out of that nice ephemeral or temporary wetland that destroys that sensitive habitat, and often they consume a lot of those animals during that process as well. Now, pigs will also compete with some of our native wildlife. We said how pigs really like acorns. Well, white-tailed deer really like acorns. Turkey really like acorns. Squirrels absolutely depend on acorns. And pigs will outcompete these animals because they're bigger and they're in bigger social groups. So the most productive oak stands, pigs are going to dominate those. They're going to push the deer off of them. They're going to push the turkey out. They're going to prevent the squirrels from practicing their caching behavior, which actually leads to reductions in oakling recruitment in the long term. So these are big impacts on our native wildlife. If you hunt deer and turkey, you might have game feeders set up. Well, wild pigs are going to dominate those too. You might plant food plots. That's great food for wild pigs. They'll root it up real quick. So there's a lot of environmental impact as well. And it's not just wildlife. There's been studies that have looked at the impact of wild pigs on water quality. So this is out of Auburn, Alabama. So up in northern Alabama, they looked at watersheds where wild pigs were present and watersheds where wild pigs weren't present. And they found that nutrients like organic nitrogen, calcium ion, sulfate, those were 2 to 11 times higher in the pig dominated watersheds than in watersheds that didn't have pigs. And sometimes those values were beyond EPA recommendations. And even more worrying, they found that E. coli concentrations, which is a dangerous bacteria that comes from pig fecal material, were up to 40 times higher in watersheds where pigs occurred. And that presents a threat to a lot of different things. Now, when we look at soil carbon sequestration, right? So that's the ability of soil to store carbon and prevent it from being in the atmosphere and contributing to increasing CO2 levels and climate change. Well, pigs are really good at turning up the soil with that rooting behavior. So it's the same thing or the same process in terms of soil carbon that might occur with tilling. And so a modeling study just out last year tried to estimate what sort of amount of land in across the globe is getting turned up just by pigs. And what they found in North America was, well, I'll check my numbers here, about 2 million acres of land in North America is uprooted just by wild pigs every year. Now, when you're uprooting that many acres of land, you're releasing a lot of that soil carbon. And they estimate, and it's an estimate because individual lands have different capabilities for storing carbon, and they're not getting too deep into the weeds, but they estimate that the release of carbon from pig rooting just in North America is the equivalent to the emissions from over 200,000 automobiles annually. So we have environmental impacts at the local scale to our wildlife. We have economic impacts to our agriculture and our livestock production. We have big scale impacts to soil and water. These are an invasive species that are causing real problems at multiple scales across the country. And I haven't even talked about disease. So wild pigs, unlike our domestic swine, are big reservoirs for a couple of dangerous diseases for us, for our cattle, and for our native wildlife. So things like brucellosis, leptospirosis, pseudorabies. On average, pigs in Florida carry, about 10% of the pigs in Florida carry these diseases. And one of the primary ways for these diseases to get introduced to our native wildlife and to our cattle are through water, right? Water is really important in Florida. It's really important for pigs. It's really important for native wildlife. So here in our rangelands, we have natural bodies of water and we have water trails. Well, pigs use those, both of those sources, and so do our native wildlife, and so do our cattle. And that's the way that brucellosis, leptospirosis, pseudorabies can get introduced from these native reservoirs in wild pigs to our native wildlife and to our cattle, and even to us. So that's why my lab recommends control efforts for wild pigs. And I recommend lethal removal. I think that's the best way to control pig populations on your land. That's the best way to limit the economic damage, the environmental damage. That's a way that we can help to enhance the ecosystem value of our working rangelands by removing invasive species. Now, I think there are some best management practices right now for how to do lethal removal, how to be most effective in terms of cost and impact. I like whole sounder trapping. That's really, I've got lots of resources in my lab out there about how to effectively practice whole sounder trapping, the tips and tricks, the different types of equipment and strategies you might need. It's really beyond the scale of this talk, but if you are interested in talking about whole sounder trapping, you're interested in increasing the effectiveness of your wild pig management on your land, feel free to come up to me afterwards, shoot me an email, give me a call. I'd be happy to chat about that anytime. And now I want to plug another one of my graduate students that's here today, got a poster back there, Briar. And Briar's a master's student in my lab, and they are really focused on examining the human dimensions of wild pig management. And so they produced an online survey that we've distributed to a lot of rural landowners, a lot of livestock producers. And in that survey, we want to know what you all know about wild pigs, what sort of damage you're experiencing on wild pigs on your land, and then what you're doing or not doing about wild pigs. And we even want to know about the positive impacts of wild pigs. There are positive benefits to wild pigs. Hunting, it can be a source of income for a lot of properties. A lot of you probably grew up hunting wild pigs. It can be fun recreationally to hunt wild pigs. So we want to know about that too. We want to understand pig management from your perspective. And so that's the goal of that survey. And we have distributed it through mailers and through a couple of online newsletters. But if you're interested and you haven't contributed your voice to that survey, we want to hear from you too. So reach out to me. And another interesting thing we've got planned along that vein is a listening session. And we're going to hold this listening session and focus in on livestock producers. We want to know all about your experiences, hear your voice on wild pigs on your land. And we've got that scheduled later in June here at the Range Cattle Center. So if you're interested in joining that group and contributing your voice and making sure you get heard, reach out to me, reach out to Laura Bennett, who's part of that team as well, or Breyer, and we'll make sure you get an invite to that. And all of this, all of Breyer's project is so we can get information to develop more effective extension programming and resources so that if you want to make a change in your land or your pig management, that we're providing you the resources that help you do that. So with that, I want to switch gears to another invasive species, one that you might not know too much about, and that's tegus. And so tegus are an invasive species in Florida. They're a relatively new invasive species. They're a ground-dwelling lizard. They're not iguanas, but they're similar sized. They can get up to 4 feet as an adult and 10 pounds. And I'm just going to step away briefly. I'm going to show you a tegu that we captured just yesterday. This is a subadult tegu. This is a 1 or 2 year old tegu, not full grown. These animals, once full grown, get about 4 feet long with their tail and 10 pounds. We captured that tegu yesterday in Charlotte County on the edge of a pasture. So these animals are here. They are established populations in Charlotte County, in Miami-Dade, in Hillsborough, and in St. Lucie County. There's lots of individual reports of tegus popping up all over the state. And I'm not the only faculty at UF that's engaged in tegu research. These are, like I said, an invasive species. So let's go through that criteria. They're non-native. They're originally from Argentina. They're introduced. The pathway for their introduction was unintentional and intentional releases due to the pet trade. These are popular pet species. And so over the last 2 decades probably, since the early 2000s, there's been a lot of reptile breeders in the States, and those populations in a lot of the established populations in Charlotte County and Miami-Dade and Hillsborough are, we know, a direct result from intentional or unintentional releases from reptile breeders. And a lot of those individual reports that we see across the state are escapees from individual pet owners. These animals, so non-native, introduced. Now, what's the harm that we know about these animals? Well, there we have to think about what they're eating. So tegus, like a lot of invasive species, are those diet generalists and habitat generalists. They consume a wide variety of species. They're omnivores as well. I'd say that they tend a little bit further towards the animal protein omnivore spectrum than pigs, but they will consume things like berries and fruit. They consume carrion, so dead animals. They consume anything they can catch, and our biggest worry is they'll take advantage of ground nesting animals, and they'll consume those eggs. So they really can hone in on turkey, on quail, on our native reptiles like turtles, even alligators and crocodiles that they've seen raiding the nest of those animals as well. And so that's our environmental harm right now. And really, Pythons get a lot of attention, iguanas get a lot of attention in Florida, but tegu have an interesting biological behavior that allows them to potentially have a bigger impact than pythons and iguana will have on the U.S., and that's that tegu enter a form of hibernation. So here in Florida, around late September, early October, tegu will go underground into their burrow. They'll stay in that burrow till about February. So they're able to avoid cold weather temperatures that would kill an iguana or a python. So what that means is that tegu, if they continue spreading, can take over much farther north. They can go into a lot of the southeast. And in fact, captive populations living in facilities outside have survived the winters as far north as northeastern Alabama. So we know that they can persist out there. But right now, they're still in this earlier phase where we can potentially control and limit their spread. So you saw how big that subadult is. The adults get to about 4 feet. When they hatch out of their eggs, they're about 10 to 12 inches. So that makes them on par with our largest native lizard, which is a skink. So pretty much at any time, any age class that you see this lizard on the landscape, it's going to be bigger than anything else you're going to see. The females, they reach reproductive maturity at 2 to 3 years of age. Now, with reptiles, it's a little bit different reproductive maturity than it is in mammals and birds. It's less tied to age and more tied to body size. So that's why there's a bigger range, and sometimes it takes longer for these animals to reach reproductive maturity. But once they do, they lay one clutch of eggs a year with about 30 eggs in it on average. Those eggs will hatch in the summer, around June, July. So we talked about what they eat. We talked about the source of tegus here in Florida, which is predominantly the pet trade via unintentional and perhaps intentional releases. What sort of landscapes do they like to use? Well, we know they like open landscapes. They like scrub. They like open pine land. They like pastures and grasslands. We know that they don't seem to like really dense forests. They're not very good at moving through it. Perhaps they're not very good at capturing prey in that landscape. Down in Miami-Dade, that's where we know the most about tegus. They use canal levees to move about the landscape. So they like linear corridors, like a lot of predators do. But most of our knowledge about tegus really comes from Miami-Dade in Florida. And we know that area near the Everglades is really different than the rangelands up here. So there's a lack of knowledge about how tegus are going to move in this landscape. But we know they're here. We know they're in Hillsborough. We know they're in Charlotte County. And so I'll plug my other graduate students project now. Alex First is doing work down in Charlotte County, and we've got crews down there today capturing tegus right now, just north of Babcock Webb WMA. And so what we're doing, partnering with FWC, is to really try to get a handle on how many tegus are in that area of Charlotte County, how far they have spread so far, and if current removal efforts that have been conducted by FWC and now UF as well are up to snuff, are meeting the need, actually causing a decrease in that population, or if we really need to ramp up our control efforts, because now is the time, right? Now's the time where we can make a big difference. Otherwise, we're going to have a tegus on the landscape potentially like wild pigs are now, right? We can manage for pig damage, but we can't remove pigs from the landscape permanently. We might still be able to do that for tegu in some areas of Florida. I think that covers everything I wanted to talk about. I'll just end that with time will tell on tegu species here in Florida, but it is important to be vigilant for this emerging threat. And with that, I'll take any questions that folks have.
Has there been any consideration when our studies done that would look at how the wild pig selects pastures based on mole cricket populations?
That would be interesting. That's something looking into. I off the top of my head, I'm not aware of anything like that, but that's an interesting concept. Yeah.
On the hogs that you trapped, did y'all draw to see what type of disease they had?
So our current trapping efforts for pigs that I'm a part of or associated with is occurring out at DeLuca Preserve, and they are not sampling for disease in those populations. Past pig control efforts by folks here at the Range Cattle Center and some of the projects out at Archibald and Buck Island, we're collecting a lot of samples to look at disease, and that's where we're getting some of those numbers. In terms of wildlife diseases, that's a little outside of my realm. Sam Wisely at IFAS Wildlife Ecology and Conservation is our big wildlife disease ecologist.
Several years ago, the Department of Agriculture did a test, and 98% of the hogs had brucellosis.
Wow, that's a really high.
Now, to get rid of them, a M1 carbine with a 30-shot clip works real good.
Yep. Yeah, and that's, like I said, our lab's got some resources out there about trapping efforts and recommendations and how to best do that. But yep, I 100% support lethal removal.
Population increase.
Well, that's part of what we're trying to figure out here in Charlotte County. They've been, FWC started trapping that population in 2018. Since then, they've removed about 400 animals. Over that time. So they were removing, the way they sort of prioritized their removal efforts was really effective removal, moving traps around when they seemed to be not catching tegu, adding more trap density when they were catching tegu. And that's effective for getting a lot of tegu, but it's not the best way to really get a solid estimate of how many tegu are on the landscape. So what we're doing now is a bit more standardized effort so that we can capture how many tegu we're capturing, and we can put that in sort of a decay model. And as over time progresses, it's going to get harder to capture a tegu because there's fewer tegu on the landscape. And using that sort of modeling principle, we can end up with a population estimate for that county. And if we collect a few years of that data, then we'll know if that's an increasing population, a decreasing population, or a stable population. So that's our strategy there. But right now, we just don't know enough.
So for the pet trade and tegus that are still here,
Yeah.
And the potential for being released, do you know like what the life expectancy is of the ones that are still being held here in captivity and risk escaping? Or
Yeah, so it'll vary. I have heard 20 years for a tegu, so they can be long-lived reptiles. That number might be in a captive pet animal, which is going to live longer than an animal living in the wild for sure. But they are long-lived reptiles.
You had mentioned that they eat a lot of like alligator and things like that. Do they also eat their own eggs? Or is it, I'm just asking a question, if they do or not.
So the females defend their nests. So probably not all that often that another tegu has the opportunity to consume eggs. That sort of behavior is not as common, but theoretically could occur. But again, the females defend those nests, so they're going to be relatively protected against that.
Do they have any predators?
Well, a 4-foot lizard, presumably some of our mammalian carnivores might be able to catch and kill it. We haven't seen a lot of data on that. They are semi-protected for half of the year when they're in their burrows or in their rock outcroppings down in Miami-Dade. But in theory, yes. Now, as juveniles, right, that was a smaller animal you saw, and that was either 1 or 2 years old animal. That animal is going to be susceptible to some of our mammalian carnivores, and the hatchling's potentially susceptible to avian predators. But again, we just don't know a lot yet. This is a relatively new problem for Florida. So. Yeah, so what we suspect is going to be the biggest environmental harm is predation on ground nesting vertebrates, so our birds and our reptiles. Now, economic harm, we don't know yet. Strawberries are probably safe because they're brumating, they're in that hibernation period during peak strawberrying, but blueberries might not be. Other fruit might not be. They do like fruit. They can definitely raid a chicken coop just as well as anything else could, and perhaps even better than a fox. So we don't know yet. Right now, they're having mainly environmental impacts down in the Everglades, like a lot of other reptiles down there. Charlotte County's population is unknown status, increasing, decreasing, we don't know. It's mainly in livestock production areas right now, but it borders Babcock Webb, which is an important area for quail. Hillsborough County status is unknown about that population. St. Lucie County is the newest one, and it's booming right now. They've removed more tegu in St. Lucie, or about the same number of tegu in St. Lucie as we have in Charlotte County, and that's a couple of years newer. So, and that's a more suburban population. So.